It started with small things, subtle, almost imperceptible changes in Amber's routine that would have meant nothing if they hadn't piled up the way they did. At first, it was the sudden obsession with her appearance. She had always been conscious of her looks. Her profession as a fitness instructor practically demanded it, but this was different. She began spending hours in front of the mirror, experimenting with new makeup, ordering expensive skincare products, and treating herself to a slew of new outfits that were far more revealing than anything she had worn before. I told myself not to overthink it. She had mentioned a new instructor at the gym, a rising star named Derek, who inspired her to push herself harder. "He's got all of us eating clean and leveling up our routines," she had said with a grin one evening, as she tossed another bag of chips from the pantry into the trash. "You'll thank me when I whip you into shape, too." I had laughed then, brushing it off, but in the weeks that followed, the changes became harder to ignore. The late nights were next. Amber started skipping dinner, claiming she was staying late for extra training sessions. "Derek says commitment separates the serious from the slackers," she had said once, packing a neatly portioned meal into her gym bag. She left the house wearing leggings and a tight crop top that seemed designed to invite stares. "Do you really need to be there every night?" I asked one evening. "You already work yourself to the bone during the day." She kissed my cheek with a practiced smile. "You don't get results without dedication, Lucas. Trust me, it's worth it." I didn't question her then. I wanted to trust her, to believe that her newfound enthusiasm was just that, enthusiasm. But the nagging doubt in the back of my mind began to grow. It didn't help that her phone seemed to have become permanently glued to her hand. She used to leave it lying around, sometimes for hours, but now it was always with her, face down on the counter or tucked in her pocket. If it buzzed, she would glance at it and then quickly dismiss the notification without explanation. It was the laughter that finally did it. A month ago, I had come home early from work, intending to surprise her with dinner. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed her standing in the front yard, phone pressed to her ear. She was laughing, soft, musical, carefree in a way I hadn't heard in years. I stayed in the car, watching her from behind the windshield. She finished the call and walked back inside, oblivious to my presence. When I entered the house moments later, she was in the kitchen, pouring a glass of wine. "You're home early," she said casually, without a hint of guilt. I asked who she had been talking to. She didn't miss a beat. "Rachel. She's thinking about joining the gym and wanted some advice." Her explanation sounded plausible enough, but something about her tone, the ease with which she delivered the lie, made my skin crawl. From that moment on, I started paying closer attention. The evidence mounted quickly. A text notification flashed briefly on her phone one evening while she was in the shower. I didn't mean to pry, but the name caught my eye, Derek. The message was casual, a joke about protein shakes, but it wasn't the content that bothered me. It was the intimacy of it, the unspoken familiarity. I dismissed it at first, chalking it up to a friendly rapport between co-workers. But as the days passed, I began noticing patterns. Derek's name came up more often in conversations, always in passing, always framed in professional terms. "Derek thinks I should try intermittent fasting. Derek recommended this new recovery drink. It's amazing." One Friday night, I offered to pick her up from the gym after her supposed late training session. She hesitated, then smiled too brightly. "Don't worry about it, Lucas. I'll just Uber home. You've had a long day." That was the moment I knew I couldn't ignore my suspicions any longer. The following Tuesday, I left work early, claiming I had a client meeting downtown. Instead, I parked my car a block away from Amber's gym and waited. I felt ridiculous, like a character in a bad detective movie, but the knot in my stomach wouldn't let me turn back. At 7:15 p.m., just as her session was supposed to be ending, I saw her walk out of the building. Not with a group of clients or her usual gym bag slung over her shoulder, but alone, with Derek. They stopped by his car, a sleek black SUV, and she leaned in close, laughing at something he said. Then, before I could fully process what I was seeing, he placed a hand on her lower back and kissed her. The world around me seemed to tilt. I gripped the steering wheel, trying to ground myself. They stood there for a moment, lost in their little world, completely unaware that I was watching. Finally, Amber climbed into the passenger seat, and they drove off together. I didn't follow them. I didn't need to. The image of them together was burned into my mind, and no amount of denial could erase it. The next morning, I called a private investigator. I didn't want to act on impulse, not without evidence. Over the next few weeks, he provided me with everything I needed. Photos of Amber and Derek meeting at a hotel, timestamped texts exchanged during her so-called training sessions, even footage of them holding hands at a restaurant across town. By the time I had all the pieces, my shock had been replaced by something colder. It wasn't just that she was cheating. It was the carelessness of it, the way she had flaunted her betrayal right under my nose. I wasn't angry, at least not yet. I was planning. The moment I had the investigator's report in my hands, I knew there was no coming back from this. The evidence was irrefutable, and even if Amber were to fall to her knees and beg for forgiveness, the damage had been done. What we had wasn't a marriage anymore. It was a performance, and I was done playing the fool. The first step was deciding how to end it. Confronting Amber outright would have been satisfying in the moment, but I wanted more than just a fleeting sense of revenge. I wanted to turn the tables, to take back the control she had so callously ripped from me. And if she thought I would let this slide quietly, she had another thing coming. That evening, I stayed late at the office, pretending to work on blueprints for an upcoming project while my mind raced with possibilities. The hum of the city lights outside my window faded into the background as I sketched out the beginnings of a plan. By the time I left the building, a cold wind biting at my face, I had resolved to dismantle the life Amber and I had built together, piece by piece. I called Serena the next morning. She had been my assistant for years, and if there was one person I trusted to handle this with the precision it required, it was her. Serena, I began after the usual pleasantries. I need your help with something personal, and I need you to promise me absolute discretion. There was a pause on the other end, followed by her steady, no-nonsense voice. Of course, Lucas. Whatever you need. I hesitated for a moment before diving in. Amber's been cheating on me. For months. I've got proof, pictures, texts, everything. And I'm ending it. Jesus, she said, the sharp intake of breath, audible even through the line. I had no idea. I'm sorry, Lucas. What can I do? I laid out the basics of what I had in mind. And by the time I finished, Serena's shock had given way to determination. So you're selling the house, she said, more a statement than a question. You want it on the market as soon as possible. Not just that, I clarified. It needs to be done quietly. Amber can't know until it's too late. Serena's professionalism shone through. I'll reach out to a discreet agent, someone who knows how to keep things under wraps. And I assume you'll need a place to move into afterward? I've already started looking, I said. I'd spent half the night scrolling through listings and had found a modest two-bedroom cottage in a quiet suburb. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and it was free of her. Good, Serena said. I'll take care of the rest. Just say the word. Over the next 2 weeks, the pieces began to fall into place. The house went on the market under a private listing, and within days, an offer came through. The buyer was an out-of-town investor who didn't care about the details as long as the paperwork was clean. By the end of the month, the deal was sealed. Amber, blissfully unaware, continued her routine of late nights and secret texts. Each time she laughed at some hidden joke or smiled at a message on her phone, I felt my resolve harden. She had no idea the ground beneath her was about to collapse. With the sale finalized, I turned my attention to the logistics of the eviction. It wasn't just about removing Amber from the house. It was about making a statement. I contacted a moving company and explained the situation in detail, ensuring they were ready to act on a moment's notice. Then, I reached out to the local sheriff's office and arranged for an officer to be present on the day in question. That's a serious step, Mr. Lucas, Officer Reynolds said when we met to discuss the details. He was a sturdy man with a calm demeanor that immediately put me at ease. Are you sure this is how you want to handle it? I'm sure, I replied without hesitation. This is the only way to ensure she leaves without a fight. The officer nodded. Fair enough. Just make sure all your paperwork is in order. If she tries to contest it, you'll need to show the sale is legally binding. It's all covered, I assured him. Reynolds gave me a small, approving smile. Then we'll be there. Just let us know when. The final piece of the puzzle was timing. I needed to catch Amber and Derek at the right moment, when their little fantasy world was in full swing. That meant waiting for one of her overnight training sessions, which, as I had confirmed through the investigator, usually ended at Derek's penthouse downtown. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. On a crisp Friday morning, Amber breezed through the kitchen, gym bag slung over her shoulder. "Don't wait up," she said, dropping a kiss on my cheek like nothing was amiss. "It's going to be a long night. Derek wants us to focus on endurance drills." I suppressed a bitter smile, nodding as if I believed her. "Have fun," I said, watching her leave. The second the door closed behind her, I grabbed my phone and called Serena. "It's happening tomorrow," I said. "Make sure everything's ready." By Saturday morning, the stage was set. The moving trucks were scheduled to arrive at 8 a.m., with Officer Reynolds following shortly after. I stood on the porch as the first truck pulled into the driveway, feeling a strange mix of anticipation and calm. As the movers stepped out, their boots crunching on the gravel, I lit a cigar and leaned against the porch railing. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the yard. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out, its song cutting through the crisp morning air. This was it, the beginning of the end. I watched as the movers approached, giving them a small nod of acknowledgement. "Let's get started," I said, my voice steady. The trucks rolled in just as the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, painting the yard in muted gold. I stood on the porch, cigar lit and resting lightly between my fingers, watching the scene unfold with a calm I hadn't felt in months. The hum of the engines filled the otherwise quiet morning, a fitting overture to what was about to take place. The movers exited their trucks with practiced efficiency. Two men in matching blue uniforms, their jackets zipped up against the early chill, approached the porch. One of them, a tall guy with a no-nonsense demeanor, nodded at me. "You're Mr. Lucas?" he asked, clipboard in hand. "That's right," I said, exhaling a steady stream of smoke. "You know the drill. Everything of mine goes. Leave the rest behind." The man gave a sharp nod. "Understood. We'll get started right away." As they moved past me into the house, I leaned back against the porch railing and took another drag from the cigar. The scent of burning tobacco mingled with the crisp morning air, grounding me as I prepared for the storm that was about to break inside. The movers worked quickly, their heavy boots echoing against the hardwood floors. Boxes were stacked and carried out in seamless rhythm, furniture disassembled with the precision of men who had done this 100 times before. From where I stood, I could hear the faint sound of their movements, drawers opening and closing, the scrape of a chair being lifted. And then there was the sound I'd been waiting for, the telltale creak of the staircase. Amber appeared first, her hair a disheveled mess, her face flushed and twisted in confusion. She was wearing one of those silk robes I had bought her for our anniversary years ago, the kind that barely covered anything. Behind her, Derek followed, his expression a mix of panic and indignation. He wasn't wearing a shirt, only a pair of wrinkled jeans, the waistband hanging precariously low on his hips. "What the hell is going on?" Amber's voice cut through the quiet like a knife, sharp and shrill. She clutched the edges of her robe, as if that alone could shield her from the reality she was waking up to. I stayed where I was, letting the moment hang in the air before speaking. "Good morning, Amber," I said, my tone casual, almost friendly. "Sleep well." Her eyes darted to the movers hauling out the coffee table and a box of books, then back to me. "Lucas, what is this? Who are these people? Why are they taking our stuff?" Derek, proving himself to be as useless as I had imagined, added, "Yeah, man, this is crazy. You can't just—" I held up a hand, silencing him. "I wouldn't finish that sentence if I were you," I said, locking eyes with him. "In fact, you might want to keep your mouth shut for the rest of the morning. Trust me, it'll go better for you that way." Amber's expression shifted, confusion giving way to anger. "Lucas, stop this right now. What is going on?" I took a slow, deliberate puff from the cigar before answering. "What's going on?" I said, letting the words roll out like smoke, "is that this house is no longer ours. It's mine, and as of yesterday, it's been sold." Her face went pale. "What? You sold the house? Without telling me?" I shrugged, flicking the ash from the cigar onto the ground. Why would I tell you? You don't live here anymore. At least, not as far as I'm concerned. Derek shifted uncomfortably behind her, glancing toward the open door like a rat searching for an escape route. Amber, he muttered, maybe we should just go. Don't you dare. Amber snapped, whirling around to face him. You don't get to tell me what to do. Watching her unravel was almost mesmerizing. I waited until she turned back to me, her chest heaving, before delivering the final blow. You've got 2 hours to pack whatever you want and get out. Officer Reynolds will make sure you leave peacefully. Right on cue, Reynolds stepped out of his patrol car and approached the porch. His uniform was neatly pressed, his expression neutral but firm. He tipped his hat slightly in Amber's direction. Ma'am, he said, I'm here to oversee the transition. You're required to vacate the premises within the allotted time. If you refuse, I'll have no choice but to escort you off the property. Amber looked at him, then back at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. You can't be serious, she finally managed, her voice cracking. Lucas, this is insane. We're married. This is our home. Was our home? I corrected, my tone colder now. But you threw that away the second you started bringing him into it. I nodded toward Derek, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable. Amber's anger flared again, her fists clenched at her sides. It wasn't like that, she shouted. You don't understand. I stepped closer, cutting her off. Save it, Amber. I've heard enough lies to last me a lifetime. This isn't a conversation. It's a fact. The house is sold. You're leaving. End of story. For a moment, she just stood there, trembling with barely contained fury. Then, as if realizing she wasn't going to win this battle, her expression shifted to something resembling desperation. Please, Lucas, she said, her voice softer now. We can fix this. We could talk about it. You don't have to do this. I stared at her, my resolve unshaken. I already did, I said simply. Behind her, Derek took a hesitant step back. Amber, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, maybe we should just go. It's not worth it. For the first time, her mask cracked. She turned on him, her voice rising again. Not worth it? You said you loved me. You said we'd figure this out together. He didn't respond, his eyes darting to the ground. I watched the scene unfold with a kind of detached satisfaction. The chaos, the panic, the crumbling of their little fantasy. It was everything I had planned for and more. The movers continued their work, unbothered by the drama playing out around them. Reynolds stood off to the side, arms crossed, ready to step in if needed. And me? I just leaned back against the railing, finishing my cigar as the morning sun climbed higher into the sky. Amber was unraveling before my eyes, her carefully curated facade crumbling as panic took hold. Derek, who had started the morning with a trace of smugness, now looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I stayed silent, arms crossed as the scene played out in front of me. This wasn't just about evicting them. It was about watching their fantasy collapse under the weight of reality. I can't believe this is happening. Amber's voice was sharp and grating, her eyes darting between me and the movers hauling out another piece of furniture. You've lost your mind, Lucas. You can't do this. I didn't bother responding. She knew as well as I did that it was already done. Derek, who had been lingering awkwardly near the staircase, finally spoke up, his tone low and hesitant. Amber, maybe we should go. This isn't worth. Don't you dare, she snapped, spinning to face him. Her voice trembled, a mix of anger and desperation. You're the one who said we'd figure this out. You promised me, Derek? He raised his hands defensively, taking a step back. Yeah, but I didn't sign up for this. This is insane. I mean, look at him. Derek gestured toward me, his voice growing louder. He's got cops and movers. This guy isn't messing around. You coward, Amber hissed, her face twisting in fury. You said you loved me, that we'd handle it together. I watched with mild amusement as Derek floundered under her wrath. His earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of self-preservation. Handle it? Derek shot back, his frustration finally bubbling over. What do you want me to do, Amber? Fight him? The house is sold. What part of that don't you get? We're done here. Amber's jaw dropped, her hands clenching into fists. You're seriously just going to walk away? After everything we've been through? After everything I've given up for you? Given up? Derek laughed bitterly, shaking his head. Amber, let's not pretend this was some epic romance. We had fun. That's all it was. And now it's over. The words hung in the air like a slap. For a moment, Amber seemed stunned into silence, her expression a mix of betrayal and disbelief. You son of a, she started, but Officer Reynolds stepped forward, his calm, commanding presence cutting through the tension. All right, that's enough, Reynolds said firmly, his hand resting lightly on his holstered belt. You've got an hour and a half left to pack up and leave. If you don't, I'll have to escort you out myself. Let's keep this civil. Amber glared at him, her chest heaving. Civil? This is my house. My life. He's the one who's... Actually, it's not your house anymore, I interjected, my voice calm but cutting. And the longer you waste time arguing, the less of your things you'll be able to pack. Her eyes snapped to me, blazing with fury. You bastard. You think you're so clever, don't you? Ruining everything just because you're too weak to, Amber. My voice was sharp, cutting her off mid-rant. Spare me the dramatics. You brought this on yourself. Now, are you going to pack? Or are you going to keep yelling until Reynolds drags you out? For a moment, I thought she might actually lunge at me. But then she turned on her heel, muttering curses under her breath, and stormed upstairs. Derek lingered for a moment, his gaze shifting nervously between me and the officer, before finally following her. The next 30 minutes were a mix of chaos and bitterness. Amber stomped around the house, grabbing items at random and throwing them into suitcases with no regard for organization. Derek, clearly done with the entire situation, stood by the door with his arms crossed, offering no help. Why aren't you helping me? Amber barked at him at one point, her voice echoing down the staircase. Why should I? He shot back. This is your mess, Amber. I'm not getting dragged into it any more than I already am. Their bickering continued, growing louder and more venomous with each exchange. At one point, Amber hurled a hairbrush down the stairs, narrowly missing Derek's head. Careful, I called out from the porch. Wouldn't want to damage my floors on your way out. Reynolds suppressed a chuckle, shaking his head. I've seen some bad ones, but this might take the cake. They deserve each other, I muttered, taking another drag from my cigar. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Amber reappeared at the top of the stairs, dragging a pair of overstuffed suitcases behind her. Her face was flushed, her hair a mess, and her eyes red with unshed tears. This isn't over, Lucas, she said, her voice low and venomous as she reached the bottom step. You think you've won, but you'll regret this. You'll see. I met her gaze, unflinching. The only thing I regret is not doing this sooner. Derek, sensing the tension, grabbed one of the suitcases and opened the door. Come on, Amber. Let's just go. She hesitated, her grip tightening on the handle of the remaining suitcase. For a moment, I thought she might try to argue again, but then she nodded stiffly and followed Derek outside. I watched from the porch as they loaded the suitcases into Derek's SUV. Amber climbed into the passenger seat, slamming the door behind her. Derek hesitated, glancing back at me with a mix of shame and defiance before getting into the driver's seat. The car started with a low rumble, and within seconds, they were pulling out of the driveway. I stood there, watching as the taillights disappeared down the street, until the sound of the engine faded into silence. Reynolds stepped beside me, adjusting his hat. Well, that's that, he said simply. I nodded, exhaling the last puff of my cigar. Yeah, that's that. For the first time in months, the air felt lighter. The house was empty, but so was the weight I'd been carrying. The dust hadn't fully settled after Amber and Derek's departure before Rachel pulled into the driveway. Her sleek red sedan gleamed under the midday sun, a sharp contrast to the disarray of the morning's events. I hadn't expected her to show up, but then again, Rachel had always been the type to act first and explain later. I was still on the porch, leaning against the railing as the movers finished clearing out the last of my belongings. Officer Reynolds had left a few minutes earlier, satisfied that order had been restored. Rachel stepped out of her car, her heels clicking against the pavement with determined precision. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a tight ponytail, and the look on her face was one of barely contained fury. "Lucas," she said sharply, her eyes scanning the remnants of the scene. "Is she still here?" "No," I replied, straightening up. "She's gone." "Why?" She stopped at the bottom of the steps, one hand on her hip. "Because I've got a bone to pick with Amber. And if she thinks she's walking away from this unscathed, she's dead wrong." Her words caught me off guard. Rachel and Amber had always been friendly, if not exactly close. But the edge in her voice hinted at something deeper. "What's going on, Rachel?" I asked. "What did Amber do now?" She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "What hasn't she done?" She took a step closer, lowering her voice. "Greg. She's been sleeping with Greg." For a moment, I couldn't respond. The name hit me like a blow, stirring a mix of disbelief and anger. Greg, her husband. My friend. What? I managed finally, my voice sharp. Rachel nodded grimly. "I found out a few days ago. Texts, calls, receipts for hotel rooms. She wasn't even subtle about it. And Greg, that idiot, tried to deny until I shoved the evidence in his face. He admitted everything." I clenched my fists, the weight of her revelation sinking in. So it wasn't just Derek. Amber's betrayal ran deeper, spreading into my circle of friends like a rot. "And you came here to tell me this now?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. "I thought you should know," she said simply. "Besides, I needed to see her. She's not getting away with this." "She's already gone," I said, motioning toward the empty driveway. "But if you're looking for closure, trust me, you're not alone." Rachel let out a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "Good. Because I'm about 5 seconds away from screaming, and I'd rather not waste it on someone who isn't here." We sat on the porch steps, the weight of everything hanging heavy between us. For a while, neither of us spoke. The movers had finished their work and were pulling out of the driveway, leaving the house eerily quiet. Finally, Rachel broke the silence. "You know what's funny?" she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "I actually liked Amber. I thought she was good for you. Greg even said she kept you grounded. Turns out, they were both lying through their teeth." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "You're not the only one who got played." She accused me of neglecting her, said I was too busy with work to notice her needs. And all the while, she was out there. I trailed off, the words sticking in my throat. Rachel turned to me, her expression sharp. "Neglecting her? That's rich. You were working to provide for her. What was she doing besides ruining everything?" "Exactly," I said, the bitterness rising in my voice. "And the worst part is, she thought she had me fooled. She didn't realize I knew. I wasn't working late, Rachel. I was gathering evidence. Pictures, texts, everything. I spent months putting it all together." Her eyes widened slightly, but she nodded in approval. "Smart. She always underestimated you." "Not anymore," I said firmly. The conversation shifted to Greg. Rachel's anger was palpable, but underneath it, there was a flicker of sadness. "Are you staying with it?" I asked cautiously. She hesitated, then shook her head. "I haven't decided yet. Part of me wants to walk out and never look back. But the other part," she sighed, running a hand through her hair. "The other part wonders if it's worth salvaging. Not for him, but for me." I nodded, understanding all too well the tug of indecision. "Whatever you decide, make sure it's for the right reasons. Don't let him guilt you into staying." "Don't worry," she said with a small, bitter smile. "Greg's days of guilt-tripping me are over." As Rachel stood to leave, she placed a hand on my shoulder. "Lucas, you deserve better than this. Don't let her take any more from you." "I won't," I promised. She nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Good. And if you ever need someone to vent to, you know where to find me." "Same goes for you," I said. With that, she walked to her car, her heels clicking against the pavement with the same determined precision as before. I watched as she drove away, the red sedan disappearing down the street. The house was unnervingly quiet after Rachel left, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions swirling in my chest. I lingered on the porch, trying to process everything she had told me about Amber and Greg. It was one thing to know my wife had betrayed me. It was another to realize her infidelity had seeped into my circle of friends, poisoning relationships I once thought were solid. I wasn't sure how long I sat there, staring at the driveway where Rachel's car had been, but the silence was broken by the distant roar of another engine. I glanced up to see a sleek black SUV pulling in, its glossy exterior unmistakable. Derek. The audacity of him showing up here again would have made me laugh if I hadn't already burned through my disbelief earlier. I stood, straightening my posture, ready for whatever excuse or cowardly plea he had cooked up this time. Derek stepped out of the car, his movements hesitant, but still carrying that irritating swagger. He wore a button-down shirt that looked like it had been hastily thrown on, half tucked into his jeans. His eyes scanned the porch nervously as he approached. "Lucas," he began, his voice tight. "We need to talk." I crossed my arms, leaning back slightly. "You've got some nerve showing up here after this morning. I thought I made myself clear." "I'm not here to fight," he said quickly, holding up his hands. "Look, I know things got out of hand earlier, but I just want to make sure Amber's okay." "She's not here," I said flatly. "And even if she was, it wouldn't be your concern anymore." Derek sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Things just, spare me the excuses," I interrupted, my tone icy. "You didn't mean for this to happen? You've been screwing my wife for months, Derek. You don't accidentally destroy someone's marriage." Before he could respond, the sound of another car pulling into the driveway drew both our attention. A white sedan came to an abrupt stop, and the driver's door flew open. "Melissa," Derek muttered under his breath, his face draining of color. A woman stepped out, her movements sharp and deliberate. Melissa was tall, her dark hair pulled into a sleek bun, and she radiated an intensity that could cut through steel. She wasted no time, marching up the driveway with a look that promised blood. "You son of a bitch," she spat, her heels clicking against the pavement. Derek barely had time to react before she slapped him across the face, the sound echoing in the crisp afternoon air. "Melissa, wait," Derek stammered, holding a hand to his reddening cheek. "Don't you dare Melissa me," she snapped, her voice trembling with rage. "Do you have any idea what you've done? How could you humiliate me like this?" I stayed silent, watching the scene unfold with a kind of grim satisfaction. If there was anyone who deserved Melissa's wrath, it was Derek. "I told you it wasn't like that." Derek tried again, his voice cracking. "Oh, shut up," she shot back. "Do you think I'm an idiot? Do you think I don't know about Amber?" She turned to me then, her expression softening slightly. "Lucas, I'm so sorry. You didn't deserve this." "Neither did you," I said simply. The sound of hurried footsteps drew our attention to the front door. Amber appeared, her face a mixture of confusion and irritation. She must have heard the commotion from the street. "What the hell is going on?" she demanded, her eyes darting between Melissa and Derek. Melissa didn't hesitate. She closed the distance between them in 2 swift strides, her finger pointed like a dagger. "You," she hissed. "You think you can just sleep with my husband and walk away like nothing happened?" Amber's mouth fell open, but no words came out. For once, she seemed genuinely at a loss. "This has nothing to do with you," she managed finally, her voice weak. "Nothing to do with me?" Melissa's laugh was bitter and sharp. "You've been screwing my husband, and you think it's none of my business? You're even more pathetic than I thought." Derek tried to step in, his hands raised in a feeble attempt to de-escalate. "Melissa, let's not do this here. We can—" "Shut up, Derek," Melissa barked, silencing him instantly. Amber's composure cracked, and she turned on Derek. "You told her," she hissed. "I thought we agreed." "I didn't tell her anything." Derek snapped, his frustration boiling over. "She found out on her own." "Amber, what did you think was going to happen? That we just keep this going forever?" The argument escalated, their voices overlapping in a chaotic mess of accusations and excuses. Melissa's fury, Derek's defensiveness, and Amber's desperation filled the air like a toxic fog. Finally, Melissa held up a hand, silencing them both. "Enough," she said, her voice low and venomous. She turned to Derek, her expression hardening. "We're done. You can explain yourself to my lawyer." Without waiting for a response, she turned on her heel and marched back to her car. The door slammed shut, and the engine roared to life as she sped away. The silence that followed was deafening. Amber and Derek stood frozen, their faces pale and drawn. I broke the quiet, my voice cold and deliberate. "Well," I said, "it looks like you've managed to ruin more than one marriage today." Amber glared at me, her anger reigniting. "You think you're so righteous, don't you? You're no saint, Lucas. You, save it." I cut her off, stepping closer. "You've lied, cheated, and destroyed everything we built together. You don't get to stand here and play the victim." She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Derek, sensing the tension, finally spoke. "Maybe we should go." "For once," I said, glaring at him. "I agree with you." They didn't argue. Amber stormed off toward the street, her shoulders rigid, while Derek trailed behind like a scolded child. I watched as they disappeared down the road, my chest tightening with a mix of relief and anger. The house was still, almost eerily so. I hadn't fully adjusted to the quiet of my new place, the absence of Amber's presence, or the way the silence seemed to stretch on endlessly. After the chaos of the past weeks, I should have welcomed the calm, but instead it felt unfamiliar, like a song played in the wrong key. I sat on the floor of the living room, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes. The movers had done their job efficiently, but I hadn't had the energy to put everything in its place. A coffee table leaned awkwardly against the wall, and a stack of books lay forgotten in the corner. In front of me, an open box held framed photos I hadn't been able to look at yet. They were mostly from the early days of my marriage, when things still felt hopeful. I reached for one, our honeymoon in Hawaii, the two of us standing barefoot on the beach, the waves lapping at our ankles. Amber had her arms around me, her smile bright and genuine. Or so I had thought. I stared at it for a moment, then set it aside, face down. Some memories weren't worth keeping. The next morning, I decided to clear my head the old-fashioned way. Running had been a passion of mine years ago, back when life felt simpler. I had loved the rhythm of it, the steady pounding of my feet against the pavement, the rush of endorphins as I pushed past my limits. But somewhere along the way, I had let it slip, replaced by long work hours and Amber's endless demands. I found my old running shoes in a box labeled miscellaneous and laced them up. They were worn but still serviceable, much like how I felt. The air outside was cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the cluttered thoughts in my mind. I started with a slow jog, the muscles in my legs protesting the sudden effort. The neighborhood was quiet, the streets lined with trees just beginning to shed their leaves. As I picked up the pace, the tension in my chest began to ease, replaced by the rhythmic cadence of my breath. That evening, I called Jake. I hadn't talked to him much since everything went down, partly because I wasn't sure how to start the conversation. But now, as I sat on the small couch in my living room, I realized I needed someone who could cut through the noise in my head. Jake answered on the third ring, his voice warm and familiar. "Lucas, it's about time. I was starting to think you'd gone off the grid." "Not quite," I said, managing a small laugh. "Just dealing with a lot." "Yeah, I heard," he said, his tone softening. "Rachel called me. She told me about Amber and, everything else. Ma, I'm sorta. That's rough." "Rough is one way to put it," I said. "But I'm managing." "Are you, though?" Jake asked, and the question hit harder than I expected. I hesitated, then sighed. Some days are better than others. It's just a lot to process, you know? Not just the cheating, but realizing how blind I was to everything. How much of myself I gave up trying to keep her happy. "That's what makes it so hard," Jake said. "You loved her, man. You gave her everything. But here's the thing. You can't carry the blame for her choices. That's on her." "I know," I said quietly. "It's just hard not to wonder if I could have done something different. If I could have seen it coming." "Lucas, stop," Jake said firmly. "She made her choices. And yeah, it hurts like hell, but you're better off without her. You deserve someone who sees your worth, not someone who takes it for granted." The sincerity in his voice cut through the doubt I'd been carrying, and for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a while. Relief. After the call, I grabbed an old leather-bound journal from one of the boxes. I hadn't written in years, but something about the empty pages felt inviting, like a blank slate waiting to be filled. I started writing about the past few weeks, about the betrayal and the confrontation, about Rachel's revelation and Melissa's fury. But as the words poured out, I found myself going deeper, reflecting on the years that had led to this point. The sacrifices I'd made, the warning signs I'd ignored, the parts of myself I'd let slip away. It was cathartic, like lancing a wound and letting the poison drain out. By the time I set the journal down, my hand ached, but my mind felt clearer. The days that followed were quiet but purposeful. I unpacked the boxes one by one, arranging the furniture and hanging pictures that didn't remind me of Amber. The cottage began to feel less like a temporary refuge and more like a home. Each morning, I went for a run, pushing myself a little harder each time. The streets became familiar, the faces of neighbors nodding in recognition as I passed. And with every mile, I felt a piece of myself returning, a version of me that had been buried under years of compromise and neglect. The conference room smelled faintly of lemon polish and ink, an oddly sterile backdrop for what felt like the final chapter of a long, messy saga. I sat across from Serena at the long oak table, the divorce papers spread out neatly between us. She adjusted her glasses, her pen poised over the last document. "Everything is in order, Lucas," she said, her tone calm and reassuring. "Amber's attorney has signed off on the agreement. All that's left is your signature." I nodded, reaching for the pen. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on me, but instead of sadness, I felt a strange sense of calm, like I was finally stepping out from under a heavy shadow. As I signed my name on the dotted line, Serena smiled softly. "Congratulations," she said, sliding the papers into her folder. "You're officially free." Free. The word echoed in my mind as I leaned back in my chair. It wasn't the kind of freedom I had once imagined for myself, but it was freedom nonetheless. Later that evening, I sat at the kitchen table in my cottage, nursing a glass of whiskey and staring at my laptop. The cursor blinked expectantly on the screen as I scrolled through a list of destinations, each one more enticing than the last. Greece. I had always wanted to go, ever since I was a kid flipping through travel magazines at the library. The thought of wandering through ancient ruins, soaking up the sun on pristine beaches, and indulging in endless plates of fresh seafood was tempting in a way I couldn't ignore. Without overthinking it, I clicked on the listing for a small, family-run hotel on the island of Santorini. The pictures showed whitewashed walls, blue-domed roofs, and terraces overlooking the Aegean Sea. It looked like the kind of place where time slowed down, where I could finally breathe. I booked the flight and accommodations in one swift motion, the confirmation email popping into my inbox seconds later. The days leading up to my departure were a blur of preparation. I packed light, a suitcase of essentials, and a journal to document the journey. It felt strange, the act of planning something for myself after years of compromising for someone else. On the morning of the flight, I stood by the door of the cottage, suitcase in hand. The place was quiet, bathed in the soft light of dawn. I glanced around one last time, taking in the home I had started to rebuild, before locking the door behind me. The drive to the airport was uneventful, but as the plane ascended into the clouds, I felt the first stirrings of excitement. For the first time in years, I wasn't looking back, I was moving forward. Santorini was everything I had imagined and more. The sun was warm on my skin as I stepped off the ferry, the salty breeze carrying the scent of the ocean and fresh citrus. The streets were narrow and winding, lined with vibrant bougainvillea and bustling cafes. At the hotel, the owner greeted me with a wide smile, his English broken but warm. He showed me to my room, a cozy space with a private terrace overlooking the sea. The view was breathtaking, a sweeping panorama of sparkling blue waters and whitewashed buildings cascading down the cliffs. I spent the first few days exploring the island, wandering through ancient ruins and quiet villages, savoring the slow pace of life. Each evening, I returned to the terrace with a glass of wine, watching the sun dip below the horizon in a blaze of gold and orange. One afternoon, I found myself sitting at a small cafe in the heart of a bustling square. The air was filled with the sound of laughter and the clinking of glasses, the scent of freshly baked bread wafting from the nearby bakery. As I sipped my espresso, I opened my journal and began to write. The words came easily, spilling onto the page like water breaking free of a dam. I wrote about the betrayal, the anger, the heartbreak, but also about the lessons I had learned, the strength I had found in myself, and the hope that was beginning to take root. By the time I closed the journal, the sun was setting, casting the square in a warm, golden glow. I felt lighter, as if I had finally laid my burdens down.